Sometimes the weight of losing everyone you love becomes too heavy to carry alone. For Elira, a healer who had spent her life saving others, there was no one left to save her from the emptiness that followed her husband and child's death. She walks into a winter storm, ready to let the cold take her, but collapses instead at the gates of an ancient keep. When she awakens, she finds herself face to face with Lord Vaelen, a vampire who has lived in these mountains for centuries. He looks at her with recognition and says words that change everything. "You're mine now." Vaelen remembers Elira from long ago, when she was young and saved his sister's life. Now she is older, marked by loss, but he sees something in her that even she has forgotten. What will happen when two souls who have lost everything find each other in the darkness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm that brought Elira to Lord Vaelen's door had been brewing for more than just the past 3 days. It had been building in her heart for 7 years, ever since the plague swept through Millbrook village like a scythe through wheat, taking her beloved Marcus and their daughter Liana with it. Elira had once been the kind of woman who hummed while she worked, whose laughter could be heard echoing from her cottage window as she ground herbs for healing salves. Her hands had been steady and sure, never doubting their ability to mend what was broken. The villagers would come to her with everything from colicky babies to festering wounds, and somehow she always found a way to help. Marcus used to tease her that she had magic in her fingertips, watching in wonder as infections cleared and fevers broke under her care. "It's not magic," she would always insist, grinding willow bark for pain or brewing chamomile tea for sleepless nights. "It's just knowing what the earth provides and how to use it." But Marcus would shake his head, pulling her close in their small kitchen as 5-year-old Liana played with her wooden doll by the fire. "No, my love, I've seen other healers work. What you do, it's something more." Those words felt like mockery now. If she truly had possessed some special gift, why hadn't it been enough to save them? Why had her magic fingertips failed when it mattered most? The plague had come in late autumn, carried by merchants from the eastern cities. It started with the Blackwood family, old Henrik and his wife Mary. Elira had done everything she knew: elderberry syrup for the fever, willow bark for the pain, steam baths with eucalyptus to clear their lungs. For 3 days, she thought she was winning. Henrik's fever broke, and Mary sat up to take some broth. Then, on the 4th day, they were both dead. The sickness spread like wildfire through dried grass. One by one, families fell. Elira worked day and night, moving from house to house, trying every remedy she knew, and inventing new ones from desperate hope. She barely slept, barely ate, pushing herself beyond exhaustion as her neighbors died around her. Marcus begged her to be careful, to rest, to think of their own family. But Elira couldn't stop. These people depended on her. She was their healer, their hope. The cruel irony was that she never got sick herself. While death visited nearly every home in Millbrook, Elira remained stubbornly, heartbreakingly healthy. She watched her friends perish, held crying children as they lost their parents, and closed the eyes of people she had delivered into the world. But not Marcus, not Liana. They fell ill on the same day, just as the first snow began to fall. Elira threw everything she had at the sickness, every herb, every treatment, every desperate prayer to gods she had stopped believing in. She held vigil by their bedsides for 6 straight days, feeding them spoonfuls of medicine, bathing their fevered bodies, whispering stories and songs to keep them tethered to life. On the 7th day, Marcus took her hand in his. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear for the first time in days. "Take care of our little flower," he whispered, using his pet name for Liana. "You're going to be fine," Elira insisted, even as she felt his pulse fluttering like a dying bird's wing. "Both of you. The fever is breaking." But Marcus just smiled, the same gentle smile that had captured her heart 15 years earlier. Promise me you won't stop healing people. Promise me you won't let this break you, she promised, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. 3 hours later, Marcus was gone. Liana lasted 2 more days. She was so small, so fragile, that the sickness seemed almost too large for her tiny body to contain. In her delirium, she called for her papa and asked Elira to read her the story about the brave princess who saved the dragon. "Dragons don't need saving, little love," Elira whispered, stroking her daughter's burning forehead. "This one does, Mama. This one is very lonely and very sad, and only the princess can help him." Those were the last coherent words Liana spoke. She died in Elira's arms, just as the sun rose on what should have been a beautiful winter morning. The plague burned itself out after that, having taken nearly half the village. The survivors buried their dead and tried to rebuild their lives. They still came to Elira for healing, but something had changed. Her hands, once steady and sure, now trembled as she worked. Her remedies were less effective, as if her doubt had poisoned her gift. More troubling were the things she began to see: shadows moving at the edge of her vision, whispers in languages she didn't recognize, strange lights dancing in the forest at night. The other villagers didn't seem to notice these things, and when Elira mentioned them to Thomas, the village elder, he gave her the kind of look reserved for people who had been touched by too much grief. "Grief can play tricks on the mind," he said gently. "Perhaps you should rest more, take some time away from healing work." But rest brought no peace. In her empty cottage, surrounded by Marcus's belongings and Liana's toys, the silence was deafening. So Elira threw herself back into her work, accepting every case, taking every risk, as if she could somehow heal the world enough to balance out her failure to save her family. The strange sightings continued, growing stronger over the years. Sometimes she would glimpse figures in the forest that didn't quite look human. Once, treating a hunter's infected wound, she saw his injury glow with an odd silver light before healing faster than should have been possible. Another time, she found herself humming a melody she had never heard before while preparing medicine, and the herbs responded to her touch in ways that defied explanation. These experiences frightened her more than the plague ever had. If she truly possessed some supernatural gift, then her failure to save Marcus and Liana became not just tragic, but unforgivable. 7 years passed this way. Elira aged rapidly, her dark hair threading with silver, her face etching itself with lines of sorrow. The woman who had once hummed while she worked now moved through her days in watchful silence. She still helped people, but the joy had gone out of it. She was going through the motions of a life that no longer felt like her own. The night she walked into the storm, she hadn't planned it. She had been sitting in her cottage, staring at Liana's wooden doll, when the wind began to howl. Something in that sound called to her, not threatening, but inviting, like a voice saying it was time to stop pretending she wanted to keep living. She put on her heaviest cloak and walked out into the blizzard. The snow was already ankle-deep and falling fast, the wind sharp enough to cut through wool and skin alike. She had no destination in mind. She simply walked, letting the storm guide her feet. The path led up into the mountains, away from the village and into country she had never explored. The higher she climbed, the more the strange sensations she had been experiencing for years seemed to intensify. The air itself felt charged, alive with possibilities that her rational mind rejected, even as her heart recognized their truth. When she finally collapsed, it was not from cold or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming sense that she had arrived somewhere she was meant to be. The massive iron gates that loomed above her were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. The keep beyond was ancient beyond measure, its stone towers reaching toward the stormy sky like fingers grasping for something forever out of reach. This was where her story began anew, though she didn't know it yet. Behind those gates waited Lord Vaelen, who had been searching for her for 30 years. In his ancient diary, its leather binding worn smooth by centuries of handling, He had written about her countless times. The healer with the silver touch returns again and again to my dreams. How does one thank someone for giving meaning to immortality? How does one repay a gift that transforms curse into purpose? I must find her. I must know if she still lives, still heals, still carries that light that saved my sister's life and reminded me what it meant to hope. But these things Elira would learn later. For now, she knew only that she had reached the end of one path and stood at the beginning of another. The storm that had brought her here was already beginning to quiet, as if it too recognized that its work was done. What she could not have imagined was that her arrival would awaken something in the ancient vampire who dwelt within those walls, not just gratitude or protectiveness, but a love that had been growing in the shadows for 3 decades, waiting for this moment when she would finally need what only he could give, a reason to want to live again. Elira awakened to warmth. After 7 years of living with a cold that seemed to have settled permanently in her bones, the sensation was so foreign that for a moment she wondered if she had died and found herself in whatever came after. But death, she reasoned, probably wouldn't smell like cedar wood and old leather or feel quite so much like the finest silk sheets she had ever encountered. She opened her eyes to find herself in a room that belonged to a different century. The 4-poster bed where she lay was carved from dark wood and draped with burgundy curtains that pooled on stone floors. Tapestries covered the walls, their rich colors depicting scenes of hunts and feasts and courtly life. A fire crackled in an enormous hearth, casting dancing shadows across the chamber. Around her throat, she felt the weight of something cool against her skin. Her fingers found a pendant, a smooth moonstone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. She had never seen it before, yet something about it felt familiar, as if she had been meant to wear it. "You're awake!" The voice came from the shadows near the window, deep and carefully controlled. Elira turned toward it, her heart hammering as a figure stepped into the firelight. Lord Vaelen was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected. He appeared to be a man in his 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and pale skin that seemed to hold the memory of sunlight rather than its reality. His clothes were well made, but simple dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar. It was his eyes that marked him as something other than human. They were the color of winter sky and held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. "Where am I?" Elira's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt heavy and uncooperative. "Safe," Vaelen replied, moving closer. "You collapsed at my gates during the storm. You've been unconscious for 2 days." 2 days. Panic flared in her chest. "The village people might need... The village is fine. The storm has passed, and Thomas has been managing things in your absence." Vaelen's tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something underneath it that made Elira study his face more carefully. "How do you know, Thomas?" For a moment, Vaelen didn't answer. He moved to a chair beside the bed and sat down, his movements graceful in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. "I know many things about Millbrook Village," he said finally. "I know that you are Elira Ashworth, the healer. I know that you lost your husband Marcus and your daughter Liana to the plague 7 years ago. I know that you blame yourself for their deaths, though you saved dozens of others during that dark time." Elira's breath caught. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I remember you," Vaelen interrupted. "Though you were much younger then, and I was different." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. There was pain there, old and carefully contained, but also something else. Recognition. "I don't understand," she said. Vaelen reached into his shirt and drew out a pendant identical to the one she wore, a moonstone that caught the firelight and threw it back in silver patterns. 30 years ago," he said quietly, "a young healer came to my family's estate. My sister was dying of a wasting sickness that had baffled every physician in 3 provinces. This healer worked for 3 days and nights without rest, trying remedy after remedy, never giving up hope, even when the rest of us had accepted the inevitable. Elira's memory stirred, reaching back through decades to a time when she had been barely 20, still learning her craft. She remembered a grand estate, a dying girl of perhaps 16, and a family desperate with grief. "Serafina," she breathed. Vaelen nodded. "My sister, you saved her life." "But she died," Elira said, confusion clouding her thoughts. "I remember. I delayed the sickness for a few weeks, but in the end, she lived for 30 more years," Vaelen corrected. 30 years of marriage, children, grandchildren, 30 years of life that she never would have had without you. The room seemed to tilt around Elira. She remembered that case clearly because it had been one of her early failures. She had managed to give the family a few extra weeks to say goodbye, but the girl had ultimately succumbed to her illness. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Many things are possible that we don't understand," Vaelen said. He leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. "What you did for Serafina, the way you healed her, it wasn't entirely natural. There was something more in your touch, something that even you didn't recognize." Elira shook her head, trying to push away memories of the strange things she had been seeing, the unusual responses her treatments sometimes provoked. "You're mistaken. I'm just a village healer. I mix herbs and set bones, and sometimes people get better. And sometimes," Vaelen said softly, "you do things that shouldn't be possible, like healing infections that should have killed, or knowing exactly what's wrong with someone before they tell you their symptoms." The accuracy of his words sent ice through her veins. She had always attributed those moments to experience and intuition, but lately, especially since Marcus and Liana's deaths, the incidents had become more frequent and more undeniable. "What are you?" she asked. Vaelen was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I am what your people would call a vampire," he said. "I have lived in these mountains for over 400 years, watching the world change around me, existing but not truly living." Elira should have been terrified. Every story she had ever heard about vampires involved blood and death and supernatural evil. But looking at Vaelen now, she felt no fear. There was something profoundly sad about him, something that spoke to the hollow places in her own heart. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked. A smile ghosted across his features, transforming his face from austere to almost beautiful. "No, Elira. I am going to protect you. I don't need protection." "Don't you?" Vaelen stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the mountain landscape. "You walked into a blizzard with no destination and no will to return. If that isn't someone who needs protection, I don't know what is." The truth of his words stung because they were undeniable. She had gone into that storm, hoping it would end her pain permanently. "I can't stay here," she said. "Why not?" "Because..." She struggled to find words for the feeling of wrongness that had been growing in her chest since she awakened. This room was too beautiful, too comfortable. She didn't deserve such care after failing the people she loved most. "Because people need me. People have needed you for 7 years, Vaelen said, turning back to face her. "You've poured yourself out for them until there's nothing left. When did someone last care for you?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked what she needed, what she wanted, whether she was all right. "That's different," she said weakly. "Is it?" Vaelen moved back to the chair, his winter sky eyes never leaving her face. "You saved my sister's life, Elira. You gave my family 30 more years with her. You gave me 30 years of letters from a sister I thought I had lost forever. Do you truly believe I would let you die in a storm when I could prevent it? You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything," he said simply. The pendant around her neck seemed to grow warmer, and suddenly she remembered where she had seen it before. 30 years ago, she had given an identical stone to a frightened young girl, telling her it would help her heal faster. It had been the last remedy she had tried, born more of desperation than knowledge. "You're mine now," Vaelen said, and though the words should have sounded possessive, they carried instead the weight of a vow. Not as a prisoner, but as someone precious who will never again have to face the world's cruelties alone. Elira closed her eyes, feeling the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart 7 years ago. She was tired of being strong, tired of carrying everyone else's pain while denying her own. For the first time since Marcus and Liana died, she wondered what it might feel like to let someone else be the protector. But accepting help meant accepting that she might deserve it, and that was a leap she wasn't ready to make. Not yet. The next morning, Elira found herself alone in the chamber with a tray of food that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Warm bread, honey, dried fruit, and tea that smelled of herbs she recognized but couldn't place. She ate slowly, her body remembering what it felt like to be properly nourished. When she felt strong enough to stand, she discovered that someone had laid out clothes for her, a simple dress in deep blue wool that fit as if it had been made for her. The fabric was finer than anything she had owned in years, soft against skin that had grown accustomed to rough homespun. Vaelen was nowhere to be seen, but he had left no locks on her door, no barriers to exploration. Either he trusted her not to flee, or he was confident she couldn't escape even if she tried. Both possibilities unsettled her in different ways. The keep was vast beyond anything she had imagined. Corridors branched off in all directions, some leading to grand halls with soaring ceilings, others to intimate chambers filled with furniture covered in dust sheets. Everything spoke of age and wealth and careful preservation. This was not the lair of a monster, but the home of someone who valued beautiful things and took care to protect them. She found the library on the 3rd floor, and it took her breath away. The room was circular, with shelves reaching from floor to ceiling, filled with more books than she had seen in her entire life. Ancient texts bound in leather sat beside newer volumes, and scrolls in glass cases lined the walls between the shelves. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny spirits. It was there, on a reading table near the window, that she found Marcus's medical journal. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating. The brown leather cover was exactly as she remembered, stained with herbs and ink, worn smooth by her husband's hands. She approached it as one might approach a ghost, afraid it would vanish if she moved too quickly. But it was real. She opened the cover with trembling fingers and saw Marcus's careful handwriting, his observations about various treatments and their effectiveness. This was the journal he had kept for 15 years, recording every case, every remedy, every success and failure. She had buried it with him, unable to bear the thought of reading his words when his voice was forever silenced. "I see you found it." Elira spun around to find Vaelen standing in the doorway. He was dressed simply again, but she noticed details she had missed the night before, the way he moved without making a sound, the careful distance he kept, as if he were afraid of frightening her. "How do you have this?" Her voice was barely steady. "I retrieved it," Vaelen said, "along with several other items from your cottage that I thought you might want to keep. You had no right." "No," he agreed quietly, "I had no right. But I couldn't bear the thought of Marcus's work being lost to time and weather." Elira stared down at the journal, her emotions a tangle of grief and gratitude and violation. "You've been watching me." It wasn't a question, and Vaelen didn't pretend otherwise. "For 30 years, he confirmed. "Not intrusively, I'm not a stalker, Elira, but I've kept track of your life, your work. I've made sure you had what you needed when I could provide it without your knowledge. The rare herbs that sometimes appeared at my door, some of them. The travelers who paid extra for my services. Occasionally." She turned the pages of Marcus's journal, seeing her husband's thoughts and observations preserved in ink that should have faded years ago. Despite her anger at Vaelen's presumption, she couldn't deny the relief of having this piece of Marcus back. "Why?" she asked. Vaelen moved into the room, but stopped several feet away from her. "Because you gave my family 30 more years with Serafina. because watching you work, seeing the way you cared for people, the way you never gave, up reminded me what it meant to have purpose. I'm not your purpose, Elira said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if they were true. Aren't you? Vaelen's pale eyes met hers. For 4 centuries I existed. I fed when I had to. I read to pass the time. I watched the world change around me. But I didn't live. Not until I saw you fighting to save my sister's life, with nothing but determination and whatever power flows through your hands. Elira closed the journal carefully. I failed her. You gave her 3 decades of life she wouldn't have had. But she still died. We all die, Elira. Even I will, eventually. The gift isn't in preventing death, it's in making life meaningful while we have it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth that Elira wasn't ready to accept. She had spent 7 years believing that her failure to save Marcus and Liana negated every life she had managed to preserve. "Show me the rest," she said. Vaelen raised an eyebrow. "The rest of what? You said you retrieved several items. Show me what else you took." He led her through more corridors, past rooms that spoke of centuries of solitary living. Finally, they reached a chamber that made her heart stop. It was a perfect recreation of her cottage's healing room. The same shelves lined the walls, filled with jars and bottles that she recognized. Her mortar and pestle sat on a table near the window, along with her scales for measuring medicines. Even the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams were exactly as she had left them. But it was the small wooden box on the center table that broke her composure entirely. With shaking hands, she opened it to find all the small treasures of her married life. The silver thimble Marcus had given her on their first anniversary, the pressed flowers from Liana's birth bouquet, the tiny shoes their daughter had worn as a baby. Things she had thought lost forever, preserved here as carefully as Dur. Museum pieces. "You had no right," she whispered, but there was no anger left in her voice, only overwhelming grief and a gratitude she didn't want to feel. "No," Vaelen said again, "but I couldn't let them be lost." She picked up Liana's tiny shoe, remembering the day they had bought them from the cobbler, how excited Marcus had been to see their daughter take her first steps. The memory should have brought only pain, but somehow, in this place that existed outside of time, it carried warmth as well. "Why preserve all this if you believed I was going to die in that storm?" Vaelen was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried centuries of loneliness. "Because I hoped," he said simply, "I hoped that somehow, someday, you would come here of your own accord. And when you did, I wanted you to know that everything you had lost still mattered. That your life, your whole life, not just the parts that served others, was precious to someone." Elira felt the second crack appear in the wall around her heart. She had been so focused on her failures that she had forgotten her successes, so consumed with guilt that she had lost sight of love. For the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to remember Marcus and Liana, not as victims of her inadequacy, but as people who had been deeply, completely loved. It was a beginning. 3 days passed in careful exploration. Elira found herself settling into rhythms that felt almost natural: breakfast, brought to her room by unseen hands, mornings spent in the library, reading books that had been written centuries before her birth, afternoons wandering the keep's endless corridors. Vaelen appeared regularly, but never intrusively, always giving her space to retreat if she wished. She was beginning to understand that the keep itself was alive in ways that defied explanation. Fires lit themselves when she entered rooms, meals appeared when she was hungry, and the temperature always seemed perfectly comfortable wherever she went. It was magic, certainly, but magic that felt protective rather than threatening. On the 4th morning, she discovered a room she hadn't seen before. The door was slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rich fabric that seemed to shimmer with its own light. When she pushed it open, she found herself in a circular chamber dominated by an enormous tapestry that covered nearly an entire wall. The tapestry was unlike anything she had ever seen. The threads seemed to move even when she was looking directly at them, creating images that shifted and flowed like memories given form. As she stepped closer, the surface began to glow with a soft silver radiance. Suddenly, she was no longer standing in the chamber. She stood in a great hall filled with warmth and laughter. Musicians played in one corner, while couples danced in the center of the room. The walls were hung with banners bearing a coat of arms she didn't recognize. A silver tree on a field of deep blue. Everything spoke of prosperity and joy and celebration. A young man moved through the crowd, perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. But his eyes, those winter sky eyes she had come to know, were bright with life and purpose. This was Vaelen, as he had been centuries ago, when he was still mortal, still human. She watched him bow to a girl of perhaps 16, who looked so much like him that she could only be his sister. Serafina was beautiful in the way that young women are beautiful, all light and hope and infinite possibility. She laughed at something Vaelen said, spinning in her silk gown as he led her into the dance. The scene shifted, and suddenly Elira was witnessing something darker. The same great hall, but now it was filled with grief instead of celebration. Serafina lay pale and still on a bed, draped in white, surrounded by physicians who shook their heads in defeat. Vaelen knelt beside her, his face a mask of anguish. There must be something, he was saying to an older man, who could only be their father. Someone who can help her. I won't let her die. My son, the older man replied, his voice heavy with resignation. We have tried everything. The physicians, the priests, even that hedge witch from the eastern provinces. Serafina is beyond mortal help now. Then I'll find immortal help, Vaelen said fiercely. The scene changed again. Now she saw Vaelen alone in a forest clearing at midnight, kneeling before a figure whose face remained hidden in shadow. Words were spoken that she couldn't hear, but she felt the weight of them, the terrible price being negotiated. When Vaelen rose, his eyes had changed. They were still the same winter blue, but now they held depths that spoke of eternity. The humanity had been burned out of them, replaced by something both more and less than what he had been. The tapestry showed her his return to the estate, the horror on his family's faces when they realized what he had become. She watched him try to explain, try to make them understand that he had done it for Serafina, that surely now he could save her. But the transformation had come too late. Even with his new supernatural strength, even with abilities that defied natural law, Serafina was beyond saving. She died 3 days after his return, never knowing what sacrifice her brother had made in a desperate attempt to preserve her life. Elira watched Vaelen's exile from the only home he had ever known, saw him wandering through decades of loneliness and self-recrimination. She witnessed his slow descent into something that was barely alive, existing but not living, feeding when he had to, but finding no joy in anything the world offered. Until the day a young healer arrived at his family's estate. The tapestry showed her own arrival 30 years earlier, though from Vaelen's perspective this time. She saw herself as he had seen her, young and determined, with hands that moved with intuitive knowledge and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She watched her younger self work tirelessly over Serafina's bedside, trying remedy after remedy, never giving up hope even when everyone else had. But more than that, she saw what she had never noticed at the time, the way Vaelen watched her work, the wonder in his eyes as he witnessed someone fighting for a life that everyone else had written off. The hope that gradually replaced despair as her treatments began to take effect. When the tapestry showed Serafina sitting up in bed, taking broth for the first time in weeks, Elira felt the power that had flowed through her hands that night. It was like seeing a color she had been blind to her entire life, silver light that seemed to pour from her touch, mending what was broken in ways that went beyond the physical. The final image was of Vaelen watching her leave the estate, something that looked almost like love already growing in his transformed heart. "I see you found the memory tapestry." Elira spun around, the visions fading as Vaelen stepped into the chamber. But now she saw him differently, not as the mysterious vampire who had claimed her, but as the broken young man who had sacrificed his humanity for love and then lived with the consequences for 4 centuries. "You were there," she said softly, "when I treated your sister. You were watching." Vaelen moved to stand beside her, gazing up at the tapestry with eyes that held the weight of memory. "Every moment. I had never seen anyone fight so hard for someone they barely knew. I failed her. You gave her 3 more years of life. 3 years she spent falling in love, getting married, having children. 3 years of letters to her exiled brother, telling him about her happiness and begging him to find his own." Elira felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say when she had started crying. "You became a monster to save her. I became a monster," Vaelen agreed. "But watching you fight for her life reminded me what it meant to be human. For 30 years, that memory has been the only thing that kept me from becoming the creature my transformation intended." She turned to face him fully, seeing past the supernatural perfection to the man underneath. "You've been waiting for me." "I've been hoping for you," he corrected, "hoping that someday I might find a way to repay what you gave my family, hoping that perhaps, if I waited long enough, you might need what I could offer in return." "And what is that?" Vaelen's pale eyes met hers, and for the first time since she had awakened in his keep, she saw him without any masks or careful distance. "A place where your healing gift is valued for what it is, not what it failed to do," he said. "A chance to save lives without carrying the weight of the ones you couldn't save alone." It was, Elira realized, exactly what she needed to hear, the morning after her encounter with the memory tapestry. Elira found Vaelen waiting for her in the small dining chamber where she had taken to eating her meals. He sat at the far end of the table, as was his custom, maintaining the careful distance that marked all their interactions. But today, something was different. His hands rested on either side of a small wooden box, and his expression carried a gravity that made her pulse quicken. "There's something else," he said without preamble, "something I wasn't sure you were ready to see." Elira took her usual seat, studying his face. Over the past week, she had grown skilled at reading the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his eyes darkened when he was remembering something painful, the slight softening around his mouth when he was pleased about something. Now she saw uncertainty, as if he were about to take a step from which there would be no retreat. "What is it?" she asked. Instead of answering, Vaelen pushed the box across the table toward her. It was made of cherry wood, polished to a warm glow, with a small silver clasp that had been crafted to look like a sleeping flower. Elira recognized it immediately. It was the memory box Marcus had made for Liana's 5th birthday, designed to hold all the small treasures. A child collects pretty stones, pressed flowers, letters from friends. Liana had kept it on the shelf beside her bed, adding to its contents regularly until the plague took her. With trembling fingers, Elira opened the clasp. Inside, nestled in silk that still smelled faintly of lavender, was Liana's wooden doll. The world seemed to tilt around her. She reached for the doll with hands that shook so violently she could barely control them. The wood was smooth and worn from countless hours of play, the painted face still bright despite the years. Liana had named her Rosebud and had refused to sleep without her for most of her short life. "How?" Elira whispered. "I went to your cottage the morning after you collapsed at my gates," Vaelen said quietly. "I knew that if, when you recovered, you would need reminders that love existed in your life before grief consumed it." Elira cradled the doll against her chest, feeling the weight of it settle into her heart, like a key finding its proper lock. For 7 years, she had tried not to think about Liana's toys, had left everything exactly as it was the day her daughter died, because changing anything felt like a betrayal. But now, holding this piece of her child's happiness, she remembered things she had forgotten. The way Lyanna would make voices for her doll during imaginary tea parties. How she would tuck Rosebud into bed each night, whispering stories about brave princesses and lonely dragons. The morning she had announced that Rosebud wanted to learn healing like Mama and had spent an hour very seriously showing the doll how to mix pretend medicines. She was going to be a healer, Elira said, surprising herself by speaking the words aloud. She used to follow me around the cottage, asking questions about every herb, every treatment. She said she wanted to help people feel better. "Tell me about her," Vaelen said. It was such a simple request, but it cracked something open in Elira's chest that had been sealed shut since the day she buried her daughter. For 7 years, no one had asked her to remember Lyanna as anything other than a tragedy. No one had wanted to hear about her laughter or her curiosity or the way she would hum while she played. She was fearless, Elira began, her voice catching on the words. When other children were afraid of spiders or thunderstorms, Lyanna would want to get closer, to understand what made them work. She once spent an entire afternoon watching a spider spin its web, asking Marcus to explain how it knew where to put each strand. The memories came flooding back. 7 years of suppressed joy, breaking free, all at once. She told Vaelen about Lyanna's first words, her first steps, the way she would climb into bed between her parents on winter mornings and demand stories about faraway places. She described her daughter's laugh bright and musical and completely uninhibited, and the way she would scrunch her nose when she was thinking hard about something. She had Marcus's hands, Elira said, looking down at her own fingers wrapped around the doll. Long and elegant, perfect for delicate work. I used to watch her draw pictures and think about all the lives those hands would save someday. They did save lives, Vaelen said softly. Through you. Every person you've healed since her death carries a piece of what she would have done. The thought had never occurred to Elira, but now it settled into her mind with the weight of truth. Perhaps Lyanna's legacy lived not in what might have been, but in what Elira had continued to do in her memory. Marcus used to say she had magic in her fingertips too, Elira continued, just like her mama. He would joke that between the two of us, we'd raise a healer powerful enough to cure death itself. Perhaps you still will, Vaelen said. Elira looked up at him, startled. What do you mean? I mean that your gift, the real gift, not just your knowledge of herbs and medicine, is growing stronger. I can see it when you move through the keep. The way plants respond to your presence, the way wounds heal faster just from being near you. What you did for Serafina 30 years ago was just the beginning. The silver light she had seen in the memory tapestry flickered at the edges of her vision, responding to her emotions. She had been trying to ignore these manifestations, to pretend they were products of grief or imagination. But here, in this place outside normal time, they felt as natural as breathing. I don't want power, she said. I just wanted my family back. I know, Vaelen replied. But sometimes what we receive isn't what we wanted. It's what we need to heal the parts of ourselves we didn't know were broken. They sat in comfortable silence as Elira continued to hold Lyanna's doll. Vaelen made no move to fill the quiet with words, seeming to understand that she needed space to feel everything that was rising to the surface. Finally, she spoke again. Why are you doing this? Really? Not the debt you think you owe, not gratitude for Serafina. Why are you taking care of me? Vaelen was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer. When he did, his voice carried 4 centuries of loneliness and hope. Because, he said, for 30 years, every time I felt the monster winning, I would remember the way you fought for my sister's life. The way you refused to give up, even when everyone else had. You reminded me what it meant to believe that every life has value, that fighting for something is worthwhile, even if you can't guarantee the outcome. He paused, his pale eyes meeting hers across the table. You taught me how to be human again, Elira. long before you. Needed saving, you saved me. In the days that followed, Elira found herself paying closer attention to the details of Vaelen's existence. How he moved through the keep with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world without disturbing it. How he always positioned himself near exits when they talked, as if ready to flee should she show any sign of fear. How he ate sparingly, and only when she insisted, as if he had forgotten that food could be a pleasure rather than merely sustenance. But it was the amulet he wore that captured her growing curiosity. She had noticed it from the beginning, a pendant that rested against his chest, usually hidden beneath his shirt, but occasionally catching the light when he moved. It appeared to be made of dark stone, perhaps obsidian, carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Whenever her healing instincts stirred in his presence, which happened with increasing frequency, she felt the amulet's influence like a wall between them. It was during their morning walk through the keep's garden that she finally asked about it. They had developed the habit of spending an hour each day among the plants that somehow thrived despite the mountain's harsh climate. Elira suspected magic was involved, but it was magic put to gentle purpose, coaxing roses to bloom in winter, encouraging herbs to grow strong despite the thin air. She had begun helping with the garden work, finding peace in the familiar rhythm of tending growing things. "That pendant you wear," she said as they worked together to harvest late-season sage. "What is its purpose?" Vaelen's hands stilled on the plant he had been examining. "You notice a great deal. I'm a healer. I notice when something interferes with natural processes." She straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "Every time my instincts respond to you, and they do, more often than you probably realize, that stone seems to push back against them." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached beneath his shirt and drew out the pendant, letting it rest against the dark fabric of his chest. Up close, she could see that it wasn't obsidian, but something else entirely, a deep red stone shot through with veins of black. "Bloodstone," he said, "carved with binding runes that are older than most civilizations. What does it bind?" "Me." The word came out flat, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "It mutes my vampiric nature, keeps me from accidentally harming anyone through loss of control." Elira studied his face, reading the careful neutrality he wore like armor. "How long have you been wearing it?" 400 years, since the day I realized what I had become. You've never taken it off?" "Never." She reached toward the pendant, then stopped when she saw him tense. "May I?" Vaelen's eyes went wide. "Elira, I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. "I should be, probably. Any sensible person would be, but I'm not. You don't understand what you're asking. The binding doesn't just suppress my strength or my hunger, it suppresses everything. Every emotion, every impulse, every connection I might form with another living being. Without it, you'd be yourself." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Vaelen shook his head slowly. "Without it, I'd be a monster." "Would you?" Elira moved closer, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of centuries of careful control. "Or would you be a man who spent 400 years convincing himself he doesn't deserve to feel anything?" Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the courtyard below. They both turned toward the sound, watching as a rider approached the keep's gates at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visit. Vaelen's expression shifted immediately from vulnerability to alertness. "Stay here," he said. But Elira was already moving toward the garden's edge to get a better view of the newcomer. The rider was Thomas, the village elder, and even from a distance she could see the strain in his posture. He dismounted heavily, as if the journey had taken more out of him than it should have. "Thomas!" Elira called down to him, worry sharpening her voice. "What's wrong?" The old man looked up, relief flooding his weathered features when he saw her. "Elira, thank the gods you're safe. I need to speak with you. Both of you," he added, glancing at Vaelen with an expression that held wariness but not hatred. They met him in the keep's main hall, where Thomas accepted a cup of hot cider with grateful hands. But the relief Elira had seen in his face was already fading, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. "There are strangers in the village," he said without preamble. "3 men, well armed, asking questions about you. They claim to be concerned relatives, but—" He shook his head. "They don't feel like family, Elira. They feel like hunters." Vaelen went very still beside her. "What kind of questions?" "About her healing work. About the strange things people claim to have seen over the years, herbs glowing in her hands, wounds healing faster than they should. They're offering gold for information, which has some of the younger folks talking more than they ought." "Hunters," Vaelen said, and there was something in his voice that made Elira's blood run cold. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. "What kind of hunters?" she asked. "The kind that know what you are," Vaelen replied. "The kind that have been waiting for your power to manifest strongly enough to track." Thomas nodded grimly. "They mentioned something about bloodlines, ancient bloodlines that were thought to be extinct." Elira felt the world shift around her, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place. The strange visions she'd been having for years, the unusual responses to her healing work, the way her abilities seemed to be growing stronger since arriving at the keep. "I'm not just a healer, am I?" she said quietly. Vaelen's pale eyes met hers, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw genuine fear there, not for himself, but for her. "No," he said. "You're not." Thomas cleared his throat. "There's something else. They're not alone. Word is spreading through the other villages, carried by merchants and travelers. Whatever you are, Elira, whatever power you carry, it's drawing attention from more than just 3 hunters." Elira sank into a chair, her mind reeling. 7 years ago, all she had wanted was to save her family. Now, it seemed, her very existence might put others in danger. "They can't have you," Vaelen said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made the air around them seem to thicken. "Whatever they want, whatever they think you are, I won't let them take you." "You might not have a choice," Thomas said, gently. "These men, they're not ordinary folk. They carry weapons blessed by priests, amulets that ward against supernatural influence. They know what they're hunting." Vaelen's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where the bloodstone amulet rested beneath his shirt. Elira watched the gesture and understood, finally, what the pendant truly represented. Not just control, but isolation. Not just protection against his nature, but protection against caring too much about anything or anyone to risk losing control. But she was already under his protection. The question now was whether he would trust himself enough to truly fight for her, or whether 400 years of self-imposed isolation had convinced him that caring was too dangerous to risk. The hunters arrived at dawn, just as Elira was discovering the truth that would change everything. She had spent the night in the keep's archives, driven by a restlessness that wouldn't let her sleep. Something about Thomas's warning had stirred memories she couldn't quite grasp, fragments of her childhood. Conversations between her parents that had stopped abruptly when she entered the room, the way her grandmother had looked at her sometimes, with a mixture of pride and fear. The archives were located in the deepest part of the keep, behind doors that Vaelen had never explicitly forbidden her to open, but had never encouraged her to explore. Now, surrounded by centuries of carefully preserved documents, she searched through records that predated her birth by decades. It was there, filed between a land deed and a merchant's contract, that she found Serafina's death certificate. The parchment was official, bearing the seal of the provincial magistrate and signed by 3 witnesses. But it was the date that made her heart stop. According to the certificate, Serafina had died 32 years ago, not 30. And more than that, the document showed that she had lived for 3 years after Elira's treatment, not the few weeks that Vaelen had originally told her. With trembling hands, Elira pulled more documents from the files. Birth records for Serafina's children, marriage certificates, property transfers. the accumulated evidence of a life lived fully for 3 decades after she should have died. But it was the physician's notes, written in Serafina's final days, that revealed the impossible truth. The patient shows no signs of natural aging since her recovery 30 years past. Her vitality remains that of a woman half her age. Most curious is the silver scarring on her chest, precisely where the young healer placed her hands during treatment. The marks glow faintly under moonlight and seem to pulse with their own rhythm. Elira's hands flew to her own chest, feeling for scars she had never noticed. Her fingers found raised lines of tissue just over her heart, silver marks that matched the description in the physician's notes exactly. "I see you found the truth," she spun around to find Vaelen standing in the doorway, but he looked different. The careful composure he usually wore had been replaced by something raw and desperate. "You lied to me," she said, though there was no anger in her voice. "Only a deep, settling understanding. I told you what I thought you could accept," Vaelen replied, moving into the archives. "The truth is more complicated. The truth is that I didn't just heal your sister. I did something impossible, something that shouldn't exist." Vaelen nodded slowly. "When you treated Serafina, you didn't just cure her illness. You gave her extended life. Decades of it. And the process left marks on both of you." Elira looked down at the documents spread before her, seeing her own life reflected in a completely new light. "That's why the hunters are coming. Not because I'm a healer, but because I'm something else entirely." "You come from a bloodline that was thought to be extinct," Vaelen confirmed. "The Ashworth name goes back 7 centuries, to a time when certain families carried gifts that bordered on divine. Your ancestors could extend life, heal injuries that should have been fatal, even grant forms of immortality. But my parents never. Your parents hid what you were, hoping the gift would skip your generation as it had skipped theirs. When you began showing signs as a child, they moved to Millbrook and taught you to think of your abilities as nothing more than skilled herbalism." The pieces of her childhood suddenly made sense. The hushed conversations that stopped when she appeared. Her grandmother's insistence that she learn to control her light without ever explaining what that meant. The way certain plants seemed to thrive under her touch, even when she was barely old enough to walk. "They were protecting me," she realized. "From people like the hunters who have come for you now," Vaelen said. "Your bloodline was hunted nearly to extinction because the power you carry can be stolen, transferred from one person to another through ritual and sacrifice." A chill ran down Elira's spine. "They don't want to kill me. They want to take my abilities." "Yes, and once they have what they want, you would be left as nothing more than an empty shell, alive but drained of everything that makes you who you are." The sound of splintering wood echoed through the keep, followed by voices that carried the authority of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. The hunters had found them. "We need to go," Vaelen said, but Elira was staring down at her hands, watching silver light dance beneath her skin like captured starlight. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The power. It's been growing stronger since I arrived here, hasn't it? That's not coincidence. The keep amplifies magical abilities. It's why I chose this place for my exile. It helps contain what I am. But for you, it's had the opposite effect." "How long have you known," she asked, "about what I really am?" Valen's pale eyes met hers, and she saw 4 centuries of loneliness and longing there. "Since the day you saved Serafina, I recognized the silver light in your healing, even if you didn't. I've been searching for you ever since, not just out of gratitude, but because—" His words were cut off as the archive doors burst open. 3 men strode into the room, dressed in dark traveling clothes and carrying weapons that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their leader was a man of perhaps 40, with graying hair and eyes like chips of flint. "Elira Ashworth," he said, his voice cultured and completely without warmth. "You've been very difficult to find. She's under my protection," Vaelen said, stepping between Elira and the hunters. As he moved, she saw him reach for the bloodstone amulet at his throat. The hunter smiled, an expression that never touched his eyes. Lord Vaelen, I presume. We know what you are, vampire. We also know that amulet you wear prevents you from accessing your full strength. Quite clever, really, but hardly helpful in your current situation. You know nothing about my situation, Vaelen replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Don't we? The hunter gestured to his companions, who began spreading out to flank them. We know you've been harboring the last of the Ashworth line. We know she's been growing in power under your protection. We also know that removing her from this keep will significantly weaken her abilities, making our work much easier. Elira felt the silver light under her skin respond to her rising fear and anger. The very air around her began to shimmer with power that she had spent 30 years learning to suppress. My work, she said, finding her voice. I'm a healer. I save lives. You're much more than that, the hunter replied. You're the key to extending life indefinitely, to healing injuries that should be fatal, to granting the kind of power that empires are built on. Did you really think we'd let such a gift remain buried in a mountain village? She's not going anywhere with you, Vaelen said flatly. The hunter's smile widened. That's where you're wrong, vampire. You see, we didn't come alone. As if summoned by his words, more figures appeared in the doorway. But these weren't hunters, they were villagers from Millbrook. Elira recognized them immediately. Young Peter from the bakery, Sarah who helped with harvests, even old Henrik's grandson Matthew. We have your people, the lead hunter said conversationally. Your former patients, your neighbors, the folks you've spent years caring for. They're currently our guests in a camp about a mile from here. Whether they remain guests or become casualties depends entirely on how cooperative you choose to be. Elira felt the world tilt around her. These people had been like family to her, especially after Marcus and Liana died. The thought of them suffering because of what she was, because of power she had, never wanted, was unbearable. Let them go, she said quietly. They have nothing to do with this. Everything to do with it, actually, the hunter replied. They're insurance that you'll come willingly, because we know what healers value most, the lives of others. Elira looked at Vaelen, seeing her own desperation reflected in his pale eyes. The bloodstone amulet at his throat pulsed with dark light, and she understood finally what choice lay before them. He could remove the amulet, unleash 4 centuries of suppressed power, and likely destroy everyone in the room, but the villagers would still die. Or she could surrender, hoping that somehow she could find a way to save both her people and herself. There's a third option, she said, silver light beginning to pour from her skin in earnest. You could discover exactly why my bloodline was feared enough to hunt to extinction. For the first time since entering the room, the lead hunter looked uncertain. Behind him, completely unnoticed, Thomas stepped through the doorway. In his weathered hands, he carried something that made Vaelen's breath catch another bloodstone amulet, its dark surface carved with different runes. Actually, the village elder said quietly, there's a fourth option, but it's going to require all of us to trust each other completely. The revelation that Thomas was far more than a simple village elder was the final piece of a puzzle that Elira was only beginning to understand. But there would be time for explanations later. Right now, there was only the choice: surrender to those who would steal her very essence, or trust in the power she had spent a lifetime trying to deny. Thomas, Elira breathed, staring at the bloodstone amulet in the village elder's weathered hands. What are you doing here? How did you get past our sentries? The lead hunter's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. That's impossible. We had men watching every approach to the keep. Thomas smiled, and suddenly Elira was seeing him as if for the first time. The man she had known for 7 years as a simple village elder now stood with a confidence that spoke of knowledge and power carefully hidden. The lines on his face seemed less like age and more like the accumulated wisdom of someone who had seen far more than any mortal should. Your sentries saw exactly what I wanted them to see, Thomas replied calmly. An old man leading a donkey cart full of winter supplies, moving too slowly to be a threat. He lifted the bloodstone amulet, letting it catch the light from the archive's windows. They didn't see the cargo I was really carrying. Vaelen's eyes fixed on the pendant with an intensity that made the air around him seem to thicken. Thomas, what you're suggesting is dangerous, yes. Possibly catastrophic if we do it wrong. Thomas looked directly at Elira, his familiar eyes now holding depths she had never noticed. But it's also the only way to save your people and keep your power from falling into the wrong hands. The lead hunter took a step forward, his hand moving to the blessed blade at his side. I don't know what game you old fools think you're playing, but no game, Thomas interrupted. A choice. The same choice every generation of Ashworth women has faced when their power fully manifested. Elira felt the silver light under her skin pulse stronger, responding to emotions she couldn't fully name. Fear, yes, but also something else. Recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting her entire life for this moment. What choice? She asked. Thomas gestured toward the documents scattered on the archive table. Your bloodline doesn't just heal, Elira. At its full power, it can bind life forces together, creating connections that transcend mortality. Your ancestors used this ability to protect entire communities, linking their life force to the people under their care. Making her a target, Vaelen said grimly. The more people she's bound to, the more power she can channel, and the more valuable she becomes to those who would steal it. Exactly. Thomas nodded toward the hunters, who had grown very still as they listened. Which is why every generation of Ashworth women has had to choose, live in hiding, using only a fraction of their abilities, or embrace their full power and become a beacon that draws both protectors and predators. The lead hunter's eyes had sharpened with new understanding. You're proposing she complete the binding ritual, link herself to the villagers permanently. I'm proposing she save them, Thomas corrected. Your men poisoned the water supply in Millbrook this morning. Slow acting, designed to give you leverage, but the effects will become lethal within hours unless treated by someone with Ashworth blood. Elira's breath caught. You poisoned the entire village? Insurance, the hunter said coolly, to ensure your cooperation. The antidote exists, but only we carry it. Wrong, Thomas said, pulling a vial of silver liquid from his coat. The antidote exists in the blood of an Ashworth who has accepted their full power. But the process of creating it, of channeling enough life force to counteract the poison, will permanently link Elira to every person she saves. Vaelen's hand moved to his bloodstone amulet, and Elira saw understanding dawn in his pale eyes. You want me to remove my binding, to use my full strength to protect her during the ritual? I want you to choose, Thomas replied. Both of you. Elira can flee with these hunters, hope they keep their word about the antidote, and spend whatever remains of her life as a source of power for others. Or she can embrace what she was born to be and save her people herself. And if the ritual goes wrong, Elira asked, then we all die, Thomas said simply. The amount of power required to heal an entire village simultaneously, it could burn through you completely if you're not properly anchored. Anchored to what? Thomas looked meaningfully at Vaelen. To someone whose life force is strong enough to sustain the connection. Someone who loves you enough to share the burden. The silence that followed was deafening. Elira felt the weight of the choice settling around her like a cloak. Save her people and risk everything, or surrender to ensure their immediate safety while dooming herself to a living death. She thought of Peter from the bakery, who had brought her fresh bread every week since Marcus died. Of Sarah, who had helped her tend the herb gardens when her hands shook too badly to work alone. Of all the people who had been kindness itself during her darkest hours, now suffering because of what she was. There's something else you should know, Thomas continued quietly. The binding isn't just one way. If you save them, if you create that permanent connection, you'll gain access to their collective life force. You'll be able to channel their strength, their memories, their experiences. In essence, you'll become immortal as long as any one of them lives. And their descendants after them, the lead hunter added, his voice tight with barely controlled greed. Generation after generation of power flowing through a single vessel. Do you see now why you're so valuable? Elira closed her eyes, feeling the silver light under her skin respond to her rising determination. When she opened them again, her gaze went first to Vaelen. If I do this, if I accept the full binding, what happens to us? Vaelen's hand tightened on his amulet. I don't know, he admitted. 400 years of suppression, suddenly released while channeling that much power I could lose control completely. Or, Thomas said quietly, you could find the balance you've been seeking for centuries. The Bloodstone doesn't just suppress your vampiric nature, Vaelen. It suppresses your capacity for connection, for love, for everything that makes existence meaningful. Better that than becoming a monster. You're not a monster, Elira said firmly. You're a man who's been carrying guilt and isolation for 4 centuries because you think it's safer than risking connection. But I'm about to risk everything on the hope that love is stronger than fear. She reached for him, her fingers closing over his, where they gripped the Bloodstone amulet. The moment their skin touched, silver light flared between them, and she felt the depth of his suppressed emotions like a physical blow. 400 years of loneliness, centuries of watching the world change while remaining frozen in place. Decades of hope and despair intertwined as he searched for her, never knowing if he would find her in time. And underneath it all, love. Not the desperate obsession she had feared, but the deep, patient love of someone who had learned to value another person's happiness above his own comfort. Trust me, she whispered. Vaelen looked into her eyes for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Always. His fingers found the clasp of the Bloodstone amulet and released it. The pendant fell to the stone floor with a sound like breaking glass, and immediately the air around them began to change. Power flowed from Vaelen like water breaking through a dam, but it wasn't the mindless hunger Elira had expected. Instead, she felt his strength wrapping around her like protective wings, ready to support whatever she needed to do. The hunters took a step back as silver and shadow began to dance through the archives, responding to forces that had been bound for too long. Last chance, the lead hunter said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Come with us willingly, and we'll provide the antidote to your villagers. Refuse, and they die while you attempt a ritual that could kill you all. Elira stood, feeling power flow through her like molten silver. Around her, the very stones of the keep seemed to pulse with responding energy. I choose my people, she said simply. I choose love over fear, connection over isolation, and trust over certainty. She turned to Thomas, who was holding the second Bloodstone amulet. What do I need to do? The village elder smiled, and for a moment she glimpsed the young man he had once been, before time and responsibility had marked him. You need to do what Ashworth women have always done, he said, placing the amulet in her palm. You need to heal the world, one connection at a time. The Bloodstone was warm against her skin. But unlike Vaelen's suppressive pendant, this one hummed with potential. She could feel it reaching out, seeking the life forces scattered throughout Millbrook village, preparing to forge connections that would last for generations. Hold on to me, she told Vaelen, feeling his power intertwining with hers. No matter what happens, don't let go. Never, he promised, his arms coming around her as silver light began to pour from her skin in earnest. The hunters raised their weapons, but it was already too late. The ritual had begun, and there would be no stopping it now. Elira closed her eyes and reached out with everything she was, seeking the poisoned villagers who depended on her. In the distance, she could feel their life forces flickering like candles in a storm. It was time to bring them home. The ritual began with pain. Silver light poured from Elira's skin as she reached across the miles toward Millbrook village, seeking the life forces of her poisoned people. But the moment her power touched the first villager's fading essence, agony shot through her like lightning. The poison wasn't just in their bodies. It was designed to corrupt any magical connection, turning her healing touch into a weapon against herself. She would have collapsed if not for Vaelen's arms around her, his own power flowing into the connection to absorb the worst of the backlash. 4 centuries of suppressed strength surged through him, but instead of the mindless hunger he had feared, she felt his absolute focus on protecting her. The hunters moved forward, weapons raised, but Thomas stepped between them and the ritual in progress. "Stop!" the lead hunter commanded. "You don't understand what you're unleashing, don't I?" Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew something that made everyone in the room freeze, a mirror the size of his palm, its surface black as midnight, but shot through with veins of silver that pulsed like a heartbeat. Elira recognized it instantly from stories her grandmother had told her as a child. The Mirror of Truth, an artifact that could reveal the true nature and intentions of anyone reflected in its surface. Her grandmother had claimed it was a legend, but seeing it now, she felt its power like a weight in the air. "The Mirror of Truth," the lead hunter breathed. "That's impossible. It was destroyed centuries ago." "Hidden," Thomas corrected, waiting for a moment when truth mattered more than comfort. He held the mirror up, angling it so that its surface reflected the lead hunter's face. "Let's see what you really are." The reflection that appeared in the black glass was not the cultured gentleman who stood before them. Instead, they saw a figure wreathed in shadow, its face gaunt with centuries of stolen life. Where his eyes should have been, empty sockets leaked darkness that seemed to devour light itself. "A life drinker," Vaelen said grimly, his voice distorted by the power flowing through him. "You're not human at all." The thing wearing the hunter's face smiled, its disguise beginning to fray at the edges. "Very good, vampire. Yes, I am what mortals become when they successfully steal an Ashworth's power. Immortal, yes, but sustained only by consuming the life force of others." Elira felt revulsion wash through her, followed immediately by fierce determination. This creature had poisoned her people, not for gold or political power, but to feed its own unnatural existence. Thomas turned the mirror toward the other hunters, revealing them to be cut from the same cloth, life drinkers wearing human faces, creatures that had once been mortal but had traded their souls for stolen immortality. "And this," Thomas said, angling the mirror toward himself, "is what I truly am." The reflection showed not the elderly village elder Elira had known for years, but a man in his prime, with silver hair and eyes that held the deep wisdom of someone who had lived through centuries of protecting the Ashworth line. Scars covered his hands and arms, not the marks of accident or age, but ritual scars that pulsed with protective magic. "A guardian," she whispered. "You're one of the Ashworth guardians." "The last one," Thomas confirmed sadly. "My family has protected yours for 7 centuries, waiting for the day when an Ashworth would be strong enough to complete the great binding." He turned the mirror toward Vaelen, whose reflection showed his true nature as well. But instead of the monster he had always believed himself to be, the glass revealed a figure of immense strength and dignity, his vampiric nature balanced by centuries of restraint and genuine care. The darkness was there, but so was light, the illumination of someone who had chosen to protect rather than prey. "You're not a monster," Elira said softly, even as power continued to flow between them. "You never were." Finally, Thomas angled the mirror toward her. Elira's reflection blazed with silver fire, her true form revealed as something between mortal and divine. Lines of light connected her to every person she had ever healed, a web of caring that stretched across years and miles. At her heart, she saw the source of her power, not magic stolen or inherited, but love given freely and returned 1,000-fold. "The last true Ashworth," Thomas said reverently, "capable not just of extending life, but of creating bonds that strengthen everyone connected to them." The lead life drinker snarled, its human disguise finally dropping completely. "Enough truth. We came for power, and power we will have." It lunged toward Elira, but Vaelen's unleashed strength met it halfway. The collision sent shockwaves through the archive, toppling shelves and scattering ancient documents. But Vaelen's 4 centuries of restraint had taught him control, even in fury. His power was focused entirely on protection, not destruction. The other life drinkers moved to flank them, but Thomas raised the mirror again, this time using it not to reveal truth, but to reflect their stolen power back at them. They shrieked as their own corrupted energy turned against them, burning away the false life that sustained their existence. Through it all, Elira maintained her connection to the villagers, feeling their poisoned life forces growing stronger as her power fought the corruption in their blood. But the effort was draining her faster than she had anticipated. "I need more," she gasped, silver light flickering around her like a candle in wind. "The poison is stronger than I thought." Vaelen's arms tightened around her, his power pouring into the connection without reservation. "Take everything you need. It could kill you." "Then I'll die protecting you," he said simply. "That's what love means." Thomas stepped closer, still holding the life drinkers at bay with reflected power. "There's another way. The mirror doesn't just reveal truth, it can bind truths together. If you're willing to accept what it shows you about yourself, about your connection to each other, it will amplify your power beyond anything the Ashworth line has achieved before." Elira looked into Vaelen's pale eyes, seeing 4 centuries of loneliness transformed into purpose. Together, he confirmed. She reached for the mirror of truth, her fingers closing around its silver-veined surface. The moment she touched it, the world exploded into light. The mirror of truth shattered in Elira's hands, its purpose fulfilled, but not before its power had shown her something that changed everything. In those final moments of reflection, she had seen not just her own true nature, but the completion of a bond that had been forming since the moment she collapsed at Vaelen's gates. They were connected now in ways that transcended the physical, their life forces intertwined, like rivers flowing toward the same sea. His vampiric eternity and her Ashworth healing power had become something entirely new, a force that could sustain and protect without consuming or depleting. As the mirror's fragments fell to the stone floor, they reformed into something else entirely. A chalice carved from the same black stone, shot through with silver veins. It was smaller than her palm, but radiated power that made the air itself seem to sing. "The Unity Chalice," Thomas breathed, his voice filled with awe. "I thought it was legend." Elira lifted. "The chalice," feeling its weight settle into her hands with perfect familiarity. Somehow, she knew exactly what it was for, as if the knowledge had been sleeping in her blood for generations. "It's not for power," she said, understanding flowing through her like warm honey. "It's for choice." The lead life drinker, its human disguise now completely burned away, circled them like a predator seeking weakness. "Whatever toy you think you've found, girl, it won't save your people. The poison is already in their blood. They're dying as we speak." "No," Elira said calmly. "They're choosing." She raised the chalice toward the ceiling, feeling its surface warm under her touch. Silver light began to pour from it, but this wasn't the raw power she had been channeling before. This was different, gentler, more precise, carrying with it the essence of free will. Across the miles, she felt each poisoned villager's life force flickering like candles in the wind. But now, instead of simply forcing her healing power into them, she was offering them a choice. Accept the connection that would bind them to her and each other, sharing strength and life across generations, or refuse and face whatever came next on their own terms. One by one, she felt them choose. Peter from the bakery, his young life barely begun, accepted the bond with eager gratitude. Sarah, mother of 3, chose connection for the sake of her children's future. Old Henrik's grandson Matthew, remembering the stories of Elira's kindness to his family, embraced the link with trust, earned through years of gentle care. With each choice freely made, the Unity Chalice blazed brighter. But more than that, Elira felt herself becoming something she had never imagined, not a healer working alone, but the heart of a community bound together by love and mutual protection. The life drinkers shrieked as the freely given power blazed through the keep, burning away their stolen essence like morning sun destroying shadows. They had fed on stolen life for so long that they had forgotten what freely given strength could do. Impossible, the lead creature gasped as its form began to dissolve. Life force can't be shared without diminishment. Someone must always pay the price. You're wrong, Elira said, feeling Vaelen's strength flowing into the chalice alongside her own, multiplying rather than dividing. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It grows. The creature made one final lunge toward her, its claws extended, but Vaelen was there first. 4 centuries of suppressed power, now channeled through love rather than hunger, met the life drinker's attack with absolute finality. The creature didn't just die, it simply ceased, its stolen existence unraveling like a tapestry with all its threads pulled loose. The other life drinkers followed, their false immortality no match for the unified power flowing through the unity chalice. They fell to silver light that didn't destroy so much as reveal, showing them for the empty husks they had become, sustained only by what they had taken from others. When the light faded, only truth remained. Elira stood in Vaelen's arms, the unity chalice warm in her hands, feeling the life forces of 47 villagers burning bright and healthy across the miles. The poison was gone, burned away by freely given healing that had cost her nothing, because it was shared by everyone who chose to receive it. It's done, Thomas said quietly, his guardian's duty finally fulfilled. The great binding is complete. Elira looked down at the chalice, then up at Vaelen's pale eyes. What happens now? Now, Vaelen said, his voice carrying 4 centuries of longing finally resolved. We build something that has never existed before. A community where supernatural and mortal coexist, where healing flows freely because it's given with love rather than demanded by need. And us? She asked. Vaelen's smile was radiant with possibility. Us? We have eternity to figure it out. Your people will live longer, healthier lives because of the binding. Their children will carry the connection forward. And we, he paused, wonder evident in his voice. We will protect and serve them, not as lords over subjects, but as family. Through the unity chalice, Elira felt the truth of his words. The villagers weren't her responsibility, now they were her chosen family, connected by bonds of mutual care that would strengthen all of them. For the first time in 7 years, she felt truly home. The great work was just beginning. 6 months later, Elira stood in the garden of what had once been Vaelen's solitary keep, watching the morning sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. In her hands, she held a staff carved from the wood of an ancient oak that had grown at the place where she first met Seraphina 30 years ago. Thomas had presented it to her on the day she officially became what the villagers had begun calling their heartkeeper, the one who maintained the bonds that connected them all. The staff was beautiful in its simplicity, its surface worn smooth by her daily touch, carved with symbols that represented each of the 47 souls linked to her through the great binding. At its crown, a piece of the unity chalice had been set, glowing with soft silver light that pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeats of her extended family. Admiring your handiwork? Vaelen's voice came from behind her, warm with the affection that no longer surprised her with its depth. She turned to see him approaching with 2 cups of tea, his movements carrying the easy grace of someone who had finally learned to be at peace with himself. The change in him over these past months had been remarkable to witness. Without the bloodstone amulet's suppression, he had discovered that his vampiric nature, when balanced by love and purpose, made him an ideal protector rather than a predator. Admiring ours, she corrected, accepting the tea and settling beside him on the stone bench they had placed among the herbs. None of this would have been possible without you. The garden around them bore testament to their partnership. Plants that shouldn't have been able to survive at this altitude thrived under their combined care. Elira's healing touch, encouraging growth, Vaelen's supernatural senses, detecting problems before they became serious. More importantly, it had become a gathering place for the villagers who made the journey up the mountain to visit their heart keeper. Today would bring another such gathering. Young Peter was coming to learn more advanced healing techniques, having discovered his own modest gift for herbalism through the binding connection. Sarah would arrive with her children, who delighted in playing among the garden paths while their mother discussed the expansion of the village's protection wards. Even Matthew had begun making regular visits, finding in the keeps library resources for the scholarly interest that the binding had awakened in him. "Do you ever regret it?" Vaelen asked, a question he posed periodically, as if he still couldn't quite believe their happiness was real. Elira considered his words while sipping her tea, feeling through the staff the life forces of her connected family. Down in Millbrook village, she could sense the baker's apprentice starting his early morning bread, his contentment with his work flowing through the bond like warm honey. She felt Sarah's quiet satisfaction as she planned the day's lessons for her children, and old Henrik's grandson's excitement as he prepared for his journey up the mountain with new books to add to their collection. "How could I regret this?" she asked, gesturing with her staff toward the garden and the keep beyond. "Look what we've built." The keep itself had been transformed from a monument to isolation into a true home. The unused chambers now served as guest quarters for villagers who wished to stay longer, as workshops where traditional and supernatural healing methods were taught side by side, and as gathering spaces where the connected families came together to celebrate births, mourn losses, and simply enjoy each other's company. Through her connection to the villagers, Elira had learned that healing was about more than curing illness or mending injuries. It was about creating connections that sustained people through all of life's challenges, about building communities where everyone's well-being was everyone's responsibility. "Thomas says the changes are spreading beyond Millbrook," Vaelen said. "Other villages are sending delegations, asking about the miracle healer who can extend life and create bonds between communities." Elira nodded, having felt the stirrings of interest through the network of connections that now extended far beyond their original group. "Some of them want what we have, others are afraid of it, and still others want to control it," Vaelen added grimly. "More life drinkers will come, seeking to steal what we've built. Let them come," Elira said with quiet confidence. "They'll find the same thing the last ones found, that power freely shared is impossible to steal." She stood, using her staff for support, not because she needed it physically, but because the contact with the wood and the chalice fragment helped her maintain her awareness of all the life forces connected to her. At 37, she appeared younger than she had in years, the binding having restored the vitality that grief had stolen. More than that, she carried herself with the assurance of someone who had found her true purpose. "The afternoon delegation from Westbrook arrives today," she said. "Their message mentioned children who are showing signs of inherited gifts." Vaelen smiled, recognizing the anticipation in her voice. Over the months, they had discovered that the great binding didn't just connect existing people, it could awaken latent abilities in their children and grandchildren, creating new healers and protectors with each generation. "Another expansion of our family," he said, rising to stand beside her. "Our family," she repeated, the words still bringing her joy. She had thought, after losing Marcus and Liana, that her capacity for family love had died with them. Instead, she had discovered that love, like her healing power, grew stronger when it was shared. Through her staff, she felt the approach of the morning's visitors. Peter was already climbing the mountain path, his eager anticipation bright in the connection. Sarah and her children were preparing to depart Millbrook, the little ones excited about seeing the magic garden again. But more than that, she felt something new stirring in the connection, the spark of life that meant Sarah was carrying another child. one who would be born into the binding and grow up knowing no other way of existence except as part of an extended, loving, protective family. "Ready for another day of miracles?" Vaelen asked, offering her his arm. Elira accepted it, feeling his strength flow into her own, their combined power rippling out through the staff to touch every life connected to theirs. Somewhere in Millbrook, she felt an infection begin to heal without conscious effort on her part. In another village, a child's fever broke because her touch, transmitted through bonds of love and freely given choice, reached him across the miles. "Every day is a miracle now," she said, starting toward the keep where their extended family would soon gather. Every single day. Behind them, the garden bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter, sustained by love that had learned it was stronger when shared than when hoarded. Above them, the ancient keep stood as proof that even the longest exile could end when the right person chose connection over fear. And ahead of them stretched an eternity of mornings like this. One, filled with the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered and love that had found its perfect expression in service to others. The healer who had once walked into a storm seeking death had instead found life beyond anything she had dared to imagine. And in finding it, she had helped others discover the same truth, that the deepest healing comes not from fixing what is broken, but from building connections that make everyone stronger. Her new story was just beginning.